what John Hardy...
I'm surprised you're preempting the review in that way, because we're not. I'll wait for the review.
Well, I'm an MP.
To the earlier...
I'm an MP. I don't work for the BBC. I can preempt away, and I think that would be a very good conclusion, and I think that's what the conclusion will be.
Looked incredibly uncomfortable, didn't he? Now, that was on the 13th of June of this year, where the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee were scrutinising the work of the BBC. Now, SNP's John Nicholson's latest victim here was Tim Davie, CBE Director General of the BBC, and to say it was quite brutal would be an understatement.
Could I begin by looking at the issue of unequal pay and women at the BBC? It's an issue that we've raised many times as a committee. Now, we all noted that your former presenter, Donna Traynor, went to an industrial tribunal in Northern Ireland, which was settled. She received compensation. Have you now won any case at all against any woman?
There's only been one that's taken to tribunal that's gone all the way, and there's been one against us. That's the number I know, which is Samir Ahmed. In terms of the situation on equal pay, if I may, is actually a good story for the BBC.
The women think that.
Well, that's because, as you know, we had to do an enormous amount of work, sort through the issue, and we're now at a point. I've just looked at the moment. We have 8 equal pay cases open internally within the BBC. These are worked through, and we'll see if there's any issue. Now, that's an achievement versus where we were. We've also got the pay frameworks in place. We've got really good systems. So, look, when we get to a situation in which we go to tribunal, no one wants that. All we're trying to do is make the right call in terms of what's the right thing to do with licence fee payer money, and that's what we did in this case.
Well, why do you keep fighting cases that you lose?
Well, we didn't lose, we settled.
We all know you lost. You had to pay her a lot of money. She would have settled before the tribunal, but you took it right to the wire. The BBC lost.
We did not lose the tribunal.
Well, your lawyers agreed on a form of words whereby you did not accept responsibility. We had a rather strange talking interview from the big boss there in Northern Ireland, which was less than gracious. But nonetheless, the BBC staff that you lost, you had to give her a lot of money. She would have taken that money if you'd offered it to her privately, but you chose not to. Now, I've got the amount that you spent on lawyers' fees. September 2021, the BBC told this committee that it spent £1.1 million of licence fee money fighting equal pay cases. Extraordinary waste of money. It's our money. It's licence payers' money. Can you update us on that figure? How much have you lost now?
I haven't got the figure in front of me for 22-23, but we'll obviously be able to give you that.
Yeah, we'd really like to know that, because that's a very important case. Can you understand how angry this makes licence fee payers? Apart from the distress for the women concerned, they're having to battle you year after year of this incessant battling with the BBC over something that's a matter of natural justice. Licence fees think this is an extraordinary waste of money.
Well, you never want to be spending money in dispute with your staff.
And don't do it.
Simple as that. What you also need to do is fully accountable and transparent in terms of, as you can be, because you can't talk about individual cases, but you want to be making the right calls in terms of whether you think you've done wrong, whether you haven't done wrong, making it right. I think the BBC's done enormous work in terms of making sure it's employment practices, equal pay, the way in which we're paying people within published bands now. It's transformed.
We had I think you drag you kicking and screaming towards this position. It was this committee that recommended the presenters' pay be published. Now, I know that Mr. Jordan was against that at the time, and said that it was a poacher's charter and that would result in a massive departure of BBC staff. Your predecessor, Tony Hall, said he had got this wrong, the BBC had got it wrong. It was this committee that had recommended it. So it's not a good use of public money, and it's an area where you yourself have agreed as an organisation that you were wrong.
I stand by my comments, which is, I think, firstly, we've made significant progress. We can all go through the history of where we're at, but I think the BBC now is an exemplary organisation in that. As leader of the organisation, I can tell you, I don't want to fight. There's no point in fighting legal cases where you think you've got an overwhelming case of losing. You take legal advice and you make a call. And we're very, very conscious of spending.
How many people are you still fighting against?
Well, I think in terms of the, as I say, we've got equal pay cases of 8. That's it. I'm not sure on the tribunal number. I'd have to send you that because we're
just Mr. Jordan looked at me surprised when I raised his name. I mean, Mr. Jordan, would you accept that the BBC was wrong, that you were wrong, and that the pay should have been published?
I'm not aware of having made a comment about that. I think the previous Director General made the comment about the Poachers' Charter, as my recollection.
Okay. Now, as you know, people tend to drop me quite interesting emails about their situation. I have it in good authority from a number of sources that a number of your presenters are sitting at home, being paid by you on full salaries, on gardening leave. Can you just confirm that's the case?
I wouldn't confirm. I'm not going to talk about specifics of presenters.
Talk about a group.
What we will do is, often in a reorganisation, there'll be people where you're putting someone, working out where they're going to go into the organisation, and they may be paid for a very short period of time. You never want to be in a position where you're wasting.
Well, this isn't a very short time. They've been sitting at home for quite a long time, actually. And here's the extraordinary thing: you've got that group of people. They're disproportionately women, by the way, and they're disproportionately, interestingly, people who've challenged you about equal pay. So a number of them feel, not unreasonably, that they're being punished. So while they're sitting at home, and we, as licence fee payers, are paying you to pay them to sit and do nothing, you're hiring freelance people to sit in the studios and to present the news.
Look, news management will always make a balanced call which says, are we doing the right thing for the licence payer? I'm not going to talk about specific cases. And I think it's right that I do that. I can say categorically, by the way, that there's no question that anyone would ever be punished in the way you're talking about. I think that is not how we work. That is not how we work, categorically.
So can you confirm that you have a group of presenters who are sitting at home on full salary?
I'm not going to go into specifics of presenter arrangements.
At the same time as you have a group of presenters sitting at home on full salary, doing nothing at home, you're hiring and paying for freelancers to go into the studio to do the job that the group of people at home aren't being allowed in to do.
You're into a very small number of people where specifically we are having discussions about their future. I'm not going to do that with the committee. I think we're making, I understand the point. I think we need a fair, good conversation with those individuals to make sure they're settled. That's where we're at. While we do that, I'm not going to get into specifics because I don't think it's fair. But in terms of while we're doing these things, you're always going to have in a schedule bits where you're going to use freelancers. That's
not that small a number, but you're not denying this group of people.
What number are you talking about?
Exist. I think the problem is if I start to identify that it's more than 5 and under 10.
Thank you.
And I have from a number of different sources, not necessarily within that group, but out with that group, that this is true. I also have it in good authority that they're disproportionately women. I also have it in good authority that a good number of them disproportionately are fighting you over equal pay for women. And I notice you're not denying any of that. So can I just confirm, since you're not denying that while these people are sitting at home, you've taken on freelancers
I am not
to do that job?
I'm not getting into specifics about individuals and their contracts.
Clearly,
so, it's not a question. So separately, I think anyone in a situation that you're describing, the key is the BBC deals with that fairly to its values and comes out to the right conclusion for the individual and their career. That's what we should be doing. Meanwhile, if there is work going on of that nature, then in any circumstance and any new schedule, you'll be using freelancers to fill some of the gaps. So absolutely.
It's clearly absurd to be keeping people sitting at home who want to work, who are not being allowed to work a job that they've done for a long time, that they're very experienced at doing, while you hire freelancers to do exactly the job that they're qualified to do. Let's move on to the issue of the BBC chair. What do you think the fallout in terms of reputational damage has been for the BBC over Richard Sharp?
I think, one is I think we've had an effective 2 years at the BBC under Sharp's leadership. This has been a well-led organisation, and in his dealings with the board, myself, he's acted with integrity. Now, there is no doubt that when he chose to resign, then the perceptions of impartiality, he refers to it himself, which is the perceptions of impartiality, the BBC, are material to the BBC. That's what Heppenstall says. Perception is material in effect. So I think once you get a situation in which that's being questioned, then rightly, then you reach the decision that Richard did.
It's one of the bizarre facets of the whole system that you at the BBC don't choose who your boss is going to be. It's odd. Nobody would set that up as a system. Instead, the Prime Minister, in this case Boris Johnson, chose Richard Sharp. People will know by now that Richard Sharp gave a lot of money to the Conservative Party, that he facilitated a loan for Boris Johnson, which of course he denies, but then he didn't tell us about that. It was a terrible mess from beginning to end. Wouldn't it be a lot better if the BBC was in a position where you could hire your own chair and actually choose somebody who knows something about broadcasting?
Well, look, as I've said, there is limits to where I get involved personally in terms of views, because I think it is appropriate. I mean, I'm hired by the board, hired by the chair. I think it's for groups like this and others to discuss the balance between governance and looking after the public interest in running the BBC versus the BBC itself. We just talked about complaints and Ofcom. That I think that's for others to decide the balance. What I can tell you as editor-in-chief and a board member is what we see as critical to running the BBC, which I've done earlier. I won't repeat the list, but I think it is really important that we have someone who can champion the impartiality and the full independence of the BBC. We agree on that. And that's actually critical. I also think, we need an individual of extremely high competence. We have a complex set of issues, whether it's look at the span of issues we've covered in this committee, everything from Eurovision to local radio to commercial. You need someone who can grasp the breadth and depth of the BBC and make the right decisions, and also hold the executive to account in some of the decisions they're making.
I agree with you about all of that, and that's why it'd be really good to have somebody who knows something about broadcasting. And of course, poor old Richard Sharp had to go into hiding during the weekend sushi that you had with Gary Lineker. Normally, the chair would be out fighting BBC's corner over such a controversial case over a weekend like that, but of course, he couldn't. Now, you've set up this independent inquiry over what people can say if they work for the BBC as presenters. And full disclosure, I've been interviewed by John Hardy, who's doing this. I spoke to him for about an hour, and he asked me lots of very good questions.
Thank you for your contribution
about this. It was a great pleasure to give my contributions. Do you know what the results of his inquiry are?
No, he's talked to me a number of, like you, in terms of interviews, and he's, the reviews is indications of the kind of field of play you're in, which is how much you restrict, how much you free, all of that balance. But we're waiting the final report, and then we'll make then we can take that and then construct the guidelines from that.
Okay, well, I can let you into a secret. My understanding is that his report will probably conclude the kind of common sense position, which is that if you're a news presenter, you're not allowed to say anything on social media that identifies your politics. If you're not a news presenter, if you're a sports presenter or a natural history presenter, you'll be given a lot more leeway to express your views. And if you're freelance, you'll have a lot more leeway than you will if you're staff. I think that's what most people think is a kind of common sense position. My understanding is that's what John Hardy.
I'm surprised you're preempting the review in that way, because we're not. I'll wait for the review.
Well, I'm an MP.
I mean, to the earlier.
I'm an MP. I don't work for the BBC. I can preempt away, and I think that would be a very good conclusion, and I think that's what the conclusion will be. I mean, looking back, you've been asked about this previously in the course of today. It wasn't great for you personally, was it, that weekend? Because you told Gary Lineker to go away and apologise. He didn't apologise. He reappeared at the end of the weekend, and he kind of won that particular tussle with you, because he went back on screen, didn't have to make any concessions. You had to concede an independent review, and the independent review, I think, from the sound of it, will probably back the Gary Lineker position rather than the Tim Davie position.
I wouldn't preempt the review. My position, I think that's a simplistic reading of the situation, if I may, because we were very clear, which is, I think that we've always said that if you're a freelancer to the BBC, that construct, by the way, that you've described, which is, I wouldn't preempt the review. I think John needs to do his work and then deliver the review. But that construct has always been something where we've said, what's the difference between someone who's a freelance, we've talked about it earlier in this session, the freelance, where those lines are versus news and current affairs. I believe that. Now, we did have a situation, look, it was, as I said earlier, it was a difficult weekend. You get to a point where you worry about viewers and you make sure you've got things back on air. But actually, we needed to resolve the situation, and how to do that was to get a review and try and get some common ground so we can move forward. That's what we do.
You didn't do that on the Friday. You did that on the Monday after all the presenters refused to come into the studio. You could have done that before that happened.
Well, hindsight's a wonderful thing, as you know.
Well, yeah, but at the end of the day, it's your job to kind of try and preempt as much as you can on these matters. And you were tough with Gary Lineker, and then you had to retreat with Gary Lineker. In terms of the BBC board, what effect do you think that had on your own standing? Do you think you still enjoy the full confidence of the BBC board?
That's definitely not a question. That's one question you can ask the BBC board.
What about the BBC executive?
Well, I hope I've got good backing of the BBC executive team. I think overall, I suspect I know where you're going. In terms of, it's been a tough time within the staff base. So I'm sure if I may, do you want to ask the question around the staff survey? I'm assuming that's where you're going.
That's mine.
Why don't I ask the questions and you just come in with the answers, depending on which member of the committee want to ask them. So, in conclusion, you do think that the BBC executive still have confidence in you.
Now, he did go on to another subject about native languages and programmes made in native languages made by the BBC. And if you want to watch that full conversation with John Nicolson and Tim Davie, you can watch it without content, because I've uploaded it and chaptered it for your delight. But there's something about John Nicolson when it comes to these select committee meetings, isn't there? He's quite dynamite. You can't keep your eyes off him. He's just incredibly intriguing and fascinating to watch, and he just keeps you glued, doesn't he? But what do you guys think? Let me know down below. And if you thoroughly enjoyed John Nicholson's line of questioning, give him a like. And also, if you're new to my channel and enjoy select committee meetings, and you enjoyed this select committee meeting, subscribe, because it's all I do. And I shall bid you farewell and take care, my friends.